Hello and welcome to this latest webcast, regcast, webinar, well, whatever you want to call it. It's all about composable IT, which roughly translates as why can't we just build and run technology the way that we want to build and run technology. I think that's about right, isn't it?
Yeah,
So
I think so.
we're on that, and I've got Tim Jeffcoat here from HPE and Tony Locke, the ever reliable Tony Locke. So HPE. So I'm never going to say that again. Yeah, absolutely. HPE reckon they've got an answer to this, Tim. So I thought you might as well sort of kick off by introducing yourself. So why do we need this composable IT thing, and why now? What's that about then?
Sure. Well, I've been working in HPE's kind of server and integrated solutions category within our service business unit for a couple of years now, and we've really seen that a lot of the technology we work with, we integrate into our products, is really kind of reaching ahead. We've reached a state where kind of processors are becoming ever more powerful. We're getting cheaper SSDs and faster fabrics. The technology is accelerated so quickly, and that being married with advanced software solutions, we just felt the time was right to rethink the way that we bring IT to market. Particularly in contrast to kind of solutions that have been around for a decade now. The number of new things have been coming to market really just came together in a way that we thought was a fantastic time, and to bring a new solution that solved some of today's
It's like Dorothy, we're not in Kansas anymore. These silos, the farming model for IT's got to go.
Precisely.
So we're going to talk about what's happening at the moment. Tony, I'm going to hand over to you in a sec. We're going to talk about the idea economy, which another fantastic term, which we are gagging to know what that means. And then we're going to have a look at whether composable infrastructure can actually respond to what's going on right now. So Tony, maybe you can kick off and tell us what the kind of situation is that's driving this need for composable infrastructure.
Sure. I mean, the register audience have told us, time after time after time, to exactly use the word that you had earlier. We're still building things in silos. That's the way we've been doing it for the last, well, as long as I've been in IT, and that goes back a very, very long time, way before most people watching were alive, never mind actually working in IT. So we've still got those silos, we've still got lots of challenges, and as you can see from a recent survey we did with the register audience, the challenges are very much in place. When we asked people, just looking at these different workload areas, have you got stuff that's really ready to deal with what's going to hit your organization in the next 3 years? Those dark green bars over to the left, they're not very big. Just over 20% is the biggest, and that's for the stuff that we've been doing for a long time. But there's lots of things there that we're only partially ready for, or nothing even in place still. And as you move down from these traditional workloads to the newer stuff, the fashionable things like the Internet of Things, DevOps, which we're going to be talking about, the integration outside of the organization into this bigger economy side. There's a lot of people out there with a lot still to do, and they know that there's a lot that needs to change to actually get them ready to deal with a very fast changing environment.
So there's a lot of problems still to solve, and there's a lot of technology that still isn't in place in the way that people want it to be.
Despite us talking about this thing for the last 10 years, it's one of those things that we've got infrastructure that's in place, but it takes time to change, and by the time we've changed, we've got to be ready to move again almost. And so that's why some of the things that Tim's going to be talking about later are really important. And so you just don't build once and then have to build again in 3 years' time and build again in 3 years' time.
So then looking at the storage and the servers and so on, that's more of the same?
Exactly. So just taking it into a bit more of the technology detail rather than the workload detail. Even our storage and x86 server environments, which we've had in place now for many decades, the numbers that say they're effective and future-proof are still well under half. There is a recognition that even the stuff that we absolutely depend on, we're okay for now in pretty much a majority of organizations, but we know that we've got to do something different. We've got to improve. And as you see, as you move down to some of the other areas, those orange bars at the bottom, where we're going to the pink bars, already falling short, are very noticeable on the charts.
Tim, does this reflect what you're seeing out there, that people aren't done in any shape or form?
Certainly, and I think what this illustrates quite nicely, if you compare what we're just looking at in kind of evolving requirements over the next 3 years and comparing that to kind of the state of people's infrastructure, I think that illustrates really well just the changing nature of the applications that a lot of organizations are using to drive their business.
And we've made a lot of change in the infrastructure in recent years to make them more resilient, more flexible, but there's still more work to be done because, again, that pace of business is accelerating all the time. It's putting ever more pressure on here.
It's almost like, I mean, infrastructure in the old days was stuff that you did. The cloud infrastructure is almost stuff that's happened to organizations. You know, it's yes, sure, it can be used, but it's not something that anyone is actively deciding how to build. I mean, yes, sorry, big banks, you're building your big clouds and getting on with that. But for many organisations, cloud is something out there that you can take advantage of, but it's not something you had any decision over how to build it. It's
like I said, the other element here that is having an effect is where, or rather how, risk is managed. You know, kind of for the last 10 years, kind of a typical resiliency platform would either be having a offsite backup or having hardware that was so resilient that it would be able to handle failure. And we're now seeing that shift more to the software, and that's something that the cloud has been able to do for people, is removing kind of that resiliency layer from hardware into software. And that dramatically changes the way that environments need to be designed and deployed.
Are people trusting the cloud, Tim?
Well, I think that's a big question. I think it's viewed as, for some applications, as perfect, but there are a lot of areas of concern.
Can I just say something here that you've heard me say before? There is no such thing as the cloud. It's not a singular entity. There are lots of different clouds, some of which reside outside of your organizations, and even those are often architecturally and functionally different. And also people are trying to build cloud-like infrastructures internally. So all this talk of the cloud is more than a little misleading, and certainly something that I know really annoys the register audience.
You must be wrong, because I spoke to my neighbour and they said, well, it's all up there now, isn't it, in the cloud? So it's,
What does your neighbour do?
Doesn't work in IT. So investment activity, Tony. Then
absolutely, and you can see from the chart again, some relatively new information from the register audience, that we are still spending. Whether things have changed in the last 2 weeks and all spending's now been put off for the foreseeable future is a different matter, particularly in the UK. But we are spending lots of money and expecting to spend lots of money still on the whole x86 side of things. Building on-premise private clouds is something, as I said, the register audience like the concepts behind cloud, the flexibility, the ability to vary things very quickly and make it more software controlled rather than physics dictating everything, physical infrastructure dictating everything. All of these ideas people will be spending money on, all the way down to this integrated software defined data center. And we've got a slide a bit later on what people think about the terminology, but there's very much the idea here that we do need to invest to make things better for ourselves. It's very clear, and it's across all areas.
I mean, what I'm getting from this is people aren't just going, I'll give it all over to some set of entities in the sky. They're very much investing in their own hardware and software, and they want that to work. They're not just handing over the reins to some vague third party.
Well, I think this is really where we start to see concepts like composable infrastructure coming into play, because the cloud is at the top of everyone's agendas, but it's not necessarily the answer to a lot of the solutions and challenges that a lot of customers we talk to are trying to solve. And that's really why composable infrastructure is relevant today, because it helps to address some of those challenges in a cloud-like manner, but still sticking to the agendas to a lot of our customers of having an on-premise strategy.
And don't get me wrong, that's not to say it doesn't have a place. It doesn't have the place. It's got a place. I think that's the difference. And I think if I flick on to the next slide, this is the dilemma that we're facing. It's how to manage both of the internal and external stuff that we've got, and actually then, because none of it matters, right? None of this stuff matters. What you want is to deliver services.
Well, I think
surely,
if you were to say none of it matters to a bank or a retailer, I think they'd have probably a different response, because they have to guarantee service levels within their organisation to keep their customers happy. And ultimately, you're right, it's those services, but they have to be able to back up those services with.
Yeah, but no banking cashier says, if only I could have some more x86 power behind it. They just want the thing to work, don't they? It's from the business perspective.
Business people never care about the physics of the IT infrastructure that delivers a service. As you say, it's all about the service, which essentially 99 times out of 100 means it's all about the application. It's the workload. And where that workload runs, and the nature of that workload is the bit that's changing quite dramatically. It's not just, the traditional apps that we've always built that take a long time to build, that we have to be very careful about because of the whole risk governance that we have wrapped around things. And, banks and insurance companies and health companies have got quite rigid requirements for the governance of that information and the applications and how they function, the security of them. So you still have to build traditional apps. They're not all going away to be replaced by these new cloud apps that you can build very quickly, try, and if they fail, well, you don't care. You build a new one. There's going to be both types of applications, but the point is you're going to have to support lots of different types of workload that we haven't had to handle before.
Yeah, exactly. And these traditional applications that we see kind of on the right here, these have been driving businesses for decades. They've been around for a while, they are tried and tested, and they represent a significant amount of investment on behalf of a lot of organizations out there. They are running their businesses on these applications today. And
applications are not going away, but we need to do other stuff as well.
And one of the key differences here between what we call the idea economy and these kind of more traditional applications is time, really. These traditional applications typically see maybe 1 or perhaps 2 updates every year and are really engineered around delivering a set of services in a reliable, predictable manner. But this isn't an agile way of doing business. If you need to make updates, you need to bring in new features, really to remain competitive, that can't be done on a 6-month or an annual basis. And the idea economy is all about taking an idea, a new business value, about that coming back to customers, a new customer demand, and integrating that into the services that an organization provides in a quick, fast manner.
So I'm sensing a kind of, from the IT perspective, and there's a frustration, which is, we'd love to deliver better services, do more with all this stuff. Yes, budgets are always tight, etc., but people don't understand how hard it is to manage all this stuff that we've already got in place. And then, if I flick onto this idea of the ideas economy, it's this idea that not only is there frustration about managing what they got, it's that there's more and more demand to do things in a new way. Because you look at the companies out there that can just run something on Amazon or whatever, and they can start a business and be, for example, the fintech companies. They can, you can start a new bank almost, in a couple of months. You can start a new bank and be in direct competition with an existing bank that still has to manage all this stuff.
And that's a perfect example of the idea economy. Gone are the days where you need millions of pounds worth of investment up front to build out a data center to support your services. You can do that in a much more agile way. But the challenge comes then, how do organizations with existing infrastructure deployments, existing applications, how do they start to leverage that? Because they can't necessarily go and just put that into public cloud because of whatever restrictions they have, data sovereignty, risks, security, and so on.
This might be a really dumb question. Okay, that's what I'm here for. So I'm proud to ask the dumb questions. But what do organizations actually want to do here? I mean, if you're a traditional organization in any vertical, are you just wanting to do what you've always done? Are you actually panicky about the fact that there's these new companies coming along and maybe eating your lunch? Or are you wanting to become massively innovative, or just do a bit of what's your feel? Question to both of you really in terms of what people are trying to achieve today.
I was going to say it varies company by company. Nearly everybody has some traditional workloads that they have to keep running. The business does run on these traditional workloads, and despite many of the cloud protagonists saying that they're going to replace everything, it's not the case. There are still some things that are very stable that need to be managed very carefully. Even your startup banks, they're not going to be building their cashier systems and their bank record systems, on the basis of we'll try it and see if it works. Because they're never going to get a license if they do, and they're probably, even if they did get a license, not going to be in business very long because it's probably going to break somewhere. And if you break as a bank, you have problems keeping customers. So there are workloads that you need to manage really carefully. There are other workloads that you need to be much more flexible, quick, reactive on, and that's getting the balance right. And how much you spend time and effort doing either of those depends on the nature of your business. For some people, they'll be very much at that front end stuff, doing stuff really quickly, that changes all the time with just a bit of background stuff that needs to be relatively stable. Others, the balance will be different. But the point is, you need to be able to do both.
And what are your customers telling you to?
Yeah, well, we've been working with a customer for about 18 months now on looking at a composable infrastructure deployment. And they are a major UK retailer. They've got high street stores, they've got large supermarkets, and they're almost exactly as Tony described. They've got a lot of core applications that they have to keep up and running to support their business. But they've also got a number of these idea economy type applications that, based on e-commerce, based on some of the mobile applications that their customers are using, that they have to innovate quickly with. And the way they achieve that today is simply by having separate silos. They've got a big stack of servers running their database workloads. They've got a big stack of servers running virtualization that supports a lot of their core infrastructure. And they're now deploying yet another separate silo to be able to run these kind of new agile applications. And the challenge they've got is that they've now got multiple silos, each with their own overheads, each with their own costs associated to them. And there's a lot of untapped resource that they've had to pay for.
It's the ultimate oxymoron, is it? The agile silos. No, that's not what we wanted to achieve. So.
And again, we've been asking the register audience about this idea of flexibility and getting rid of silos since I've been working with the register, since it started. And everyone loves the idea. But what we've found that has happened over the last decade or two is that we've just built bigger silos that, instead of being functionally aligned to one application, maybe running several virtualized environments, but it's still a silo or multiple virtualized silos. And so that's the thing we've got to try and really get it into much more of a pooled type sim, where we can use all resources rather than just getting different bundles of resources that more effectively work.
And there isn't really any kind of one size fits all.
No.
With this specific customer, they have some applications that can't be virtualized. It has to be run bare metal. And yet they're trying to really move away from that. But there are some that's just that the application works much better just in a bare metal environment.
It's just the overhead of...
Precisely.
Yeah.
And they're looking at running it in containers, try and make it a bit easier to manage and so on. But for this customer, moving that workload to the cloud, it's never going to work. And so they needed a solution that would allow them to not only run these traditional applications, but also these new type applications, but on an infrastructure that wasn't separate silos, that was easy for them to manage, that they could really move faster and unlock a lot of the value in a lot of the expenditure and the investment they're making.
So that there's always going to be workloads, let's say a real big number crunching workload, that if you run it directly on a piece of hardware, it will run at 100% of its possible efficiency. If you try and run it in any other shape or form, a bit of virtualization, it will run at 90 or 80% of its efficiency, and you can't afford to lose that 10, 20%. That's what it boils down to.
Precisely.
Yeah, there will always be workloads that are very specific to definite types of infrastructure. If you're doing your high performance computing, you want that running on probably dedicated infrastructure if you're really serious about it, because you need the very best you can get from it. But the workloads that you can put into these shared environments, that's grown enormously over recent times, and it's about to grow even more, hopefully.
So, I mean, do people have the smarts to, sure, it could be about, well, we could decide to run this here and that there and so on and so forth, but is that how IT departments are structured in order to achieve that?
It's an interesting question, and again, the Reg audience have told us time after time that they're in a state of flux. Things are changing. The silos within the larger enterprise environments are beginning to come down. Some are further advanced than others, but again, they like the idea that people can be multi-skilled, look after more than just the servers or the storage or the networking or security or backup. So we're beginning to see an erosion of that skill differentiator as the management tools become better, and as the infrastructure underneath it becomes, to a degree, less specialised or better managed, so that the specialisation doesn't need such a skill
A DBA
set
that
on top of it.
understands the network, is that?
Well,
That might be a step too far.
Just throw it in there.
Well, does anybody understand the network?
Well, that's true. Does anyone understand the database? No.
But I think the other shift that we're seeing is not just these kind of hardware silos, these hardware teams combining, but also being an element of kind of application development into that as well. So we're seeing developers starting to work a lot closer with their hardware counterparts, because they have to be able to meet this the faster timescales required.
It's the DevOps side of things is beginning to happen. Strangely though, most of the publicity around DevOps tends to have focused on the development side of things, less on the ops side. The ops have tended to be, the last people in the chain involved in that in many organisations, even though some research we carried out last year showed that, actually in organisations that whether it's being driven by ops or dev is actually quite balanced across many organisations. That some of the things that we've seen that have really been lacking there is getting a good feedback cycle from ops into dev so that the developers can actually change the way maybe some of the applications work based on how they are operating in the real world environment as opposed to how they're composed, so that you can make them more efficient, etc., more secure, stuff like that. Getting that feedback cycle is really important, and it's still something that's pretty early days on DevOps in particular.
I've got a nasty feeling. I was talking to an organisation who was saying that they essentially, how to put this, about a decade ago, they actually believed some of the hype around the fact that everything was going to work perfectly without them having to do much. And so they got rid of a lot of their engineers. They got rid of a lot of their hardware engineers, the developers and so on. And only recently they're going, oh no, hang on, we do need engineering. We need hardware engineering, software engineering, etc. And they're buying in all the engineers. So it's kind of the tables are turning back in the other direction.
We've also seen examples where organisations have said we want to move, more and more into the cloud. And some people have done that. Others have moved into the cloud and then said, actually, for a variety of different reasons, it makes more sense to bring some things back again. But it's about getting that balance point. And as Tim said earlier, there's no one solution that fits all. And in particular, it's probably no one solution that fits an organisation over a period of time. Exactly where the balance points lie will change continuously.
Right. Even though we're kind of out of recession, we've got some speed bumps ahead of us with what's been going on with Brexit and so on. But what's going to be interesting is what that's going to do to IT budgets over the next 12, 24, 36 months. Over the last few years, we've been in a bit of a season of resurgence here in the UK. And in fact, the calendar Q1 this year, server spend was up 5% versus 2015. Wow. So we were in a growing market. Hopefully that's going to continue, but I think that remains to be seen. But what is still certain is that IT budgets haven't been growing all that quickly. Spend might have been increasing on hardware, but by far the biggest cost in any organisation isn't the hardware; it's the people. It's managing all of this. It's keeping it all running, and this is why fragmented management tools and things like this are such a challenge.
Absolutely. And again, it's come up in survey after survey after survey. Whenever we've asked the register audience, they've told us that getting investment in management tools is even harder than getting investment in any other part of IT, because making the business case for, but aren't you doing something with a management tool already? Or how many management tools have you got? That's the issue. It's being able to actually automate more of those management processes, which we are seeing, begin to bubble up into the procurement chain, so that those guys are recognizing, the value of automation, because they know that they can't keep on hiring people. And as Tim said, people are the expensive element.
Which responds to the underinvestment.
Absolutely. So making the case is really the tricky part, always has been for IT.
And this is really where we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, we've gone through a bit of a journey through these types of integrated solutions that have been really designed to help try and solve some of these challenges with time to market and the cost of people.
I was going to say, the really important element on this particular chart, I think, is the bottom right-hand side here, where it's talking about life expectancy of systems. Again, all of the feedback we get from, the folks out there tells us that their infrastructure, it's no longer on a 3 or 4 year depreciation cycle. It's up at 4 or 5 years, in some cases 6 or 7 years. And that lifetime expectancy is going to go on and on. And so back to the silo thing, we put in some converged systems some time ago, or we built some silos some time ago based around virtualization, but now we've got to put in infrastructure that we know we're going to be able to manage and expand and use for considerably longer periods of time than we've ever really thought about in the past. And so that flexibility for whatever we put in now, we need to be able to grow with it rather than be fixed and confined by it for, we can probably be fixed by it for 3 years, but now people know that it's going to be in place for 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 or 8 years even. Okay, bits will be replaced certainly, but the infrastructure, the package as a whole, needs to be much more resilient, reliable, and in place for longer.
Well, hold that word, flexibility. We just got one question very quickly came in, one for you, Tony, very quick answer. It says, is your survey data global or just UK?
It varies depending on the surveys that we do. Some of it's global, some of it's So the register audience in particular, when we survey the reg audience, it's basically English language respondents, so very heavily UK centric, so 50%, 40% UK centric, 35, 40% US centric, the rest coming from Australasia, New Zealand, South Africa, Singapore, India, places like this. So the register survey data is Anglophone, in essence, where the reg readers are. The other surveys that we carry out tend to be worldwide, and certainly a lot of the stuff that we say here is pretty much across the globe. It's not just restricted to the UK.
Okay, thank you. So back to that word flexibility. So I'm going to be looking at you, Tim, because we talked earlier about the word hybrid being more of a consequence than an active, that you don't kind of go, let's buy some hybrid infrastructure, do you? It's what you end up with. But you're very keen on the word composable as an answer to what is an increasingly important question. So maybe you can talk us through that. Why now, on in terms of where we are on the journey towards composable?
Yeah, precisely. So, I mean, as you can see from the chart,
it was a bit of a setup there, but it says chart, so I just need to get you into that one.
You teed me up nicely, I think.
Go for it.
HP as a vendor views composable as almost that next step that is kind of one of a longer journey, moving away from this kind of siloed traditional IT to infrastructure that is ready for any workload, that is much more flexible. Coming to that word you mentioned, much more flexible to be able to adapt to changing demands within an organization. And again, if you look at kind of the flow here, with the wave of converged infrastructure arrived kind of 5, 6, 7 years ago, and it was good news because it helped to make that time from kind of ordering some new tin to actually having it up and running. It shortened that cycle. So it meant that customers could deploy a new system, have it up and running sooner, and see their business value sooner. But it was still a silo, still very virtualization centric. We've seen a shift over the last 2 to 2.5 years with this concept of hyper-converged, so using even more software to increase the agility of infrastructure. And hyper-converged takes us a step closer, but is still very virtualization centric and virtualization orientated.
I was going to say the other thing about the converged and the hyper-converged is that the building blocks that they're based on were, very much, mono components. So the converged, you had the servers and the storage essentially inside the package linked together, whereas in the hyper-converged, you've got servers and storage as modules tightly integrated amongst themselves and then linked together inside the hyper-converged box. But the modules that you could put in there were relatively small in terms of the diversity they had. They had limited diversity.
And with converged infrastructure, it was always just a case of taking kind of existing ingredients and kind of gluing them together. So a blades, a SAN, some networking, kind of gluing it together to make it a bit more agile.
And you still need to know which server points to which LUN and all that stuff.
Exactly.
So.
And we've seen some innovation in terms of management tools to be able to look after these environments, but they were still only ever for these specific environments rather than being able to address an entire set of requirements.
Yeah, the workloads that ran on them were pretty specific, and the same to a degree applied to hyper-converged until recently. The other thing is that not everybody has yet moved to converged, and even smaller numbers have yet moved to hyper-converged. So it's still very much an evolutionary cycle that people may have bits of everything here.
The way I see it, and again, looking at it from the Lummox perspective, is converged, hyper-converged, they're still technologists solving technology problems. The more composable approach is actually more of a solution-based view, which is we've solved the technology problems, you can now build stuff the way you want to build it. Is that fair, or are we going to see a fifth stage, which is, okay, it's working now in a few years' time?
Well, if there is a fifth stage, I think it's still going to rely on technology. I mean, today with composable infrastructure, it allows us to run kind of traditional converged and hyper-converged all in a single environment, but it still requires different physical bits of silicon. We've got processors and memory and SSDs, which are physically separate bits of silicon. If there is another step on here, it's going to be the collapse of all of this into a single piece of silicon, but that's still 5-10 years away. But what we can do today is really exciting because it allows a customer to deploy a single environment that they can run their traditional applications on, whether that's bare metal or whatever it might look like. They can also on that same bit of infrastructure under the same management environment run software-defined storage and have a hyper-converged like environment, or they can make it look like a converged infrastructure environment. So it just gives a customer the flexibility to be able to run what they need when they need it.
Mm-hmm. And I've flicked onto the next slide because that's pretty much what you were talking about there. So you've got the API there, you can just plug anything into it,
and that part
sounds great.
Yeah, well, the API is vitally important.
Yeah.
Because that's what public cloud is great at. A developer can address and deploy new infrastructure in the cloud through several lines of code, and that's one of the major drawing points for public cloud. But for organizations that aren't able to leverage that or have restrictions on where they can use and store data and so on, it's not a viable solution. But what composable infrastructure brings to the table is this unified API where a developer through a single line of code can deploy compute, storage, and fabric according to the needs of their application. And so that unified API is really one of the game changers when it comes to composable infrastructure.
So it's all just working and it's all fantastic, but then we've got a bit of a, let's say, a reality check, which is the fact that if it is all software defined and it is all going to work out of the box, we need people that are actually geared up and understand and have thought about the processes around how to build it that way.
Well,
you can't take 1,000 people and just go, just do it, can you?
Well, it's also the case that the terminology software defined at the moment, it's very hard to find any vendor that doesn't say it's doing software defined. Very, very hard, almost impossible. And there's still a degree of skepticism about what exactly, how ready is software defined infrastructure for real world production workloads. As you can see from the chart, most people understand that it's happening, but it's not really a targeted thing. Are we moving to completely software-defined data centers? A small number are, the vast majority are. It's more that we're moving there almost by accident rather than design. And it's clear that people like the ideas of the management flexibility we're talking about, and whether that's software-defined or not, to a degree, doesn't really matter. What matters is the control that we can exert over it and how easily we can make it do what we want to do, and make it do what we want to do much more aligned to the business needs rather than the physics of the infrastructure that we've got in place, which has been the way it's been in the past. We can't change things very easily. If service levels change or if the requirements of the business for protection change.
In reality out there, are people wanting things to be more flexible, or are they kind of just going, look, can I just get on with the job? Everything's working fine. I just want to get on with the job. Why do you keep giving me new ways of doing things? It's all... Are you pushing against an open door when you go and see your customers and, oh, thank goodness you're sorting out this stuff? Or are they going, yeah, I can kind of see the benefit, but maybe we'll get around to it. What's their take?
Well, what we're increasingly seeing is that organizations, when it comes to IT, kind of want to get in, get out, and get on with the rest of their business. And composable infrastructure allows a lot of the mechanics of running IT to not only be automated through things like software defined in this unified API, but it allows it to simply do its job and get out of the way so the business can focus on its core challenges, which are keeping its customers happy and solving its business needs. So that the business value in composable infrastructure is that it increases the agility, the ease at which an organization can leverage its IT and allow it to do its job.
I guess, if I flick on, a lot of this is down to, they're going to want to spend money to save money if they come to you, aren't they, ultimately? So looking at this list of things, you can reduce stuff, you can deploy it faster, etc. It's like save money, save money, save money, save money, isn't it?
Well, it's not just about saving money. It's about delivering more business value at the end of the day. So, reducing over provisioning and saving capex. Yes, there's an element of saving money there, but it's about reducing all these redundant overheads and all these disparate silos. Make it easier for your staff to manage your infrastructure, which allows them to go back to adding more value to the business. So, all of these different points, all these different benefits all point back to business value rather than just technology and IT.
And over provisioning, believe it or not, is still a major issue for the readers out there today. Quite often it's still the case that we put in more stuff than we actually need today, partly because we're not quite sure that the business knows how things are going to grow anyway, but also that's the way budgeting works as well, and that's one of the issues that we need to change to provide this flexibility. It's the way things are budgeted for and paid for by the business for IT. But it's getting people to really understand, is Composable different from hyper-converged and converged infrastructure? That's the key of this. What physically is different about it, so that we can say, okay, I can see that.
So, Tim, what's getting people to sign on the dotted line for you when they come to you and say, yeah, I'll have some of that? What's their main 1 or 2 reasons for them to say, yep, I definitely need some of this now?
The main reason is simply management.
Right.
The key driver behind composable infrastructure is having a unified management tool that makes it easy to provision these fluid resource pools. And when we take customers through the story that we have with composable management, that's what really resonates and what really makes a difference.
I would have to say there's a lot of talk out there about things like bimodal IT, which to me is what we've been talking about for 20, 30 years, in terms of, yes, we need people that can both manage the legacy and be doing innovation all at the same time. As far as I'm concerned, most people don't want anything to do with the stuff that they don't need to. So if the legacy could manage itself, thank you very much. We don't need someone to be wanting to worry about that. What we do want to do is be able to just let that sort itself out and get on with the innovation stuff, get on with the exciting stuff, new projects, new developments.
The big difference now is that 20 years ago, when we could afford to do things like over provisioning, it's much more difficult to make a sound business case for that now. Organisations have got more used to the idea that instead of just buying everything up front for the next 3 years, that we buy it more as we need it. But also because of this whole flexibility issue, that we're not quite sure what, particularly for new workloads, the demand's going to be like, or how long it's going to be there. So we need the flexibility to actually ramp up provisioning really quickly if we need to, and then maybe take it away really quickly once that peak in demand has gone, or when we've moved on to the next version of something. That's the whole thing about management flexibility that's really important here.
Yeah. A customer that we're working with at the moment on looking at some of the early bits of hardware we've got around composable infrastructure is very much interested in exactly that. Their workloads are very peaky. And so, sometimes they'll launch a new product or new service, and their demands will ramp up very significantly and then slowly come back down. So they wanted an environment where they could dynamically allocate their resource to where it needed to be, and then pull it back into this fluid resource pool for use for other projects. And so it's really given them the agility, but also the speed of deployment to be able to ramp up when they need to, and then pull down when they need to, in a very cloud-like way, but with their own on-premise infrastructure, both bare metal and virtualized.
So with the on-premise benefits, but doing it in a cloud-like way. That's what it's all about.
And that's the other thing, that Composable mustn't become just another silo itself, as we said earlier. You need to be able to manage potentially beyond the silo, perhaps pulling in storage resources from outside or data from outside the box, maybe using other compute resources if it's something particularly specific in terms of its workload characteristics, but managing it all in that coherent entity framework, so that you don't have to have lots of different composable silos, for example.
So I'm getting from this. Yeah, sure, it's a bit about saving money, but that's not the compelling driver. The compelling driver is about making stuff easier to manage or just manageable, so you can then start delivering better and spinning up the flywheel faster. Sounds attractive. So, but what's going to get in the way, I guess, is the next question.
I was going to say, one other thing that's really important there is the whole idea of simplifying management, because again, the register audience tell us time after time, and my own experience as an IT pro tells me that it's usually when people make changes that something goes wrong. And so if you do want to create a much more flexible, manageable infrastructure, then clearly there's more management going on. But if I'm making those management changes, I need to be very clear that I'm not going to be making something bad happen or create, a service interruption of some sort. So that's why the whole idea of actually automating more and more of this in line with those demands, so that as services change and as service demand changes, the resource provisioning changes, preferably automatically, or if I press a button, so that it's all using some pre-schemed, pre-tested way of changing things, so that that service failability, just doesn't happen. But yeah, what's going to get in the way? It's very much the sort of things that we've been talking about. Top one there is very much to do with service levels. In the past, when we talked about service levels, it's tended to be wrapped around the idea of availability, because essentially availability was the easiest thing to measure. In the last 5 or 10 years, we've begun to move much more to look at things like the service speed, how much demand do we get for this, so that we can actually provision more in line rather than over provision up front. So making sure that we've got a really good understanding both of what services we are delivering and that are running in this infrastructure, how important they all are with respect to each other, because one thing that we haven't mentioned is that even if you've got a really manageable infrastructure, it's probably not infinite in extent in terms of its physical capacity. So therefore there may be times when some things need to be throttled to give others, that performance hit that they need. So that whole question of getting a good handle on SLAs is really important. And the rest really flow from some of these things. The operational process change. If we are going to be integrating teams, how do we make sure that our processes that we run things with work effectively here? Budget evolution we talked about just very briefly, but if you're running on a shared infrastructure and you're going to be doing more just-in-time type provisioning as things grow, how are your existing IT budgets set up to deal with that? Because again, we've had conversations with the registered audience that tell us we're still not really in that position yet. We do a lot of project stuff, which tends to be one hit up front, and rather than dynamic budget capacity there. And that runs through to actually getting that flexibility with external resources in place. Do we use public cloud if we need to get some resource that we don't have on site at the moment? If so, which workloads can we move out, which ones don't we not want to move out? And linked to that, of course, is the whole security data protection thing. One thing we've talked about with register readers in the past is we put in place, the converged and the hyper-converged platforms, but sometimes we don't always remember that they need protection and backup and replication maybe as well in there. So making sure that we've got adequate security and data protection wrapped around this new system that might be much more flexible, but then it's have to deal with a whole range of different security characteristics and data protection characteristics.
Is regulation the kind of death of agility? I don't know. It's can you have agile methods in a highly regulated environment? Are you working with finance customers?
We are, and obviously it's challenging to be able to stay within the regulations that are in place, but it's possible. And some of the examples that we were talking about a little bit earlier about some of these new fintechs, startups that are proving that it is possible to be a bank and be agile, are evidence that it is possible and anything necessary for these types of organisations to move in this way.
Presumably, the platform itself needs to have some kind of So when you build a service, you're already building it in such a way that you can still do your reporting.
Yeah, and we're seeing a demand for changing consumption models. The cloud consumption model, buying per VM hour is something that's quite easy to understand and predict for. But buying servers up front, that's a bit more challenging. And so we're seeing a kind of a desire from a lot of our customers to move to a more agile consumption model. Instead of buying a server based on its cores or its memory, to buy a server on kind of how and when you're going to use it, and Composable really plays nicely into that.
So which of these challenges are you seeing the most of then, Tim? Is it more the security stuff? Is it more just not having the right management process in place? What are your customers having the most difficulty with, would you say?
I think most difficulty probably is more around the management and provisioning than the meeting security requirements and regulation, because regardless of the type of IT environment, that's the regulation is always going to be there.
Yep.
If they can use some of the concepts that we've been developing with composable infrastructure, fluid resource pool, a unified API and software-defined intelligence, that all adds up into a solution that is quicker and easier for them to do what they need to do.
I mean, that suggests to me that, this to state the bleeding obvious, anyway, that you couldn't just kind of give them this and they'd have a happier existence. There's got to be both IT change and process change and everything all happening at once. So maybe that you've got to send in a few consultants to help out on this stuff, haven't you?
But this is definitely a journey. It's not a step change, and this is going to take time.
That wasn't a consultancy pitch, by the way. I'm just thinking you can't just switch it on and it'll work. So.
And we're not expecting organisations just to have that step change from what they're doing today to composable. It is going to take time to move to this type of practice and to really take advantage of some of the things that a composable infrastructure offers.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the interesting things about the idea of this flexible infrastructure, that if you do change things, that things like your data protection and security policy stays wrapped around that workload wherever it sits within your composable infrastructure or any other part of your infrastructure. And that's always been something that's been difficult to do, because it tends to be that the security is maybe wrapped around the workload, not around the physical box that the workload's running on, rather than being intimately associated with the service itself. And so that's something that needs to change to make the two become very much combined into one entity.
One way or another, if you want flexibility, you've got to have flexibility everywhere. It's you can't make the systems more flexible without the people being more flexible. And to your point, you've got to then build that in with security
and you need to have more of the automation elements as well, because you don't want to be making lots of manual changes all the time, because you haven't got the resources to do that. But the audience tell us that all the time. And again, as I said, that creates change friction of its own in terms of risk of service interruption.
Yeah, as soon as you've got a hurdle.
Because in the past you set up IT, and if it ain't broke, you don't fix it, because fixing it or changing it is when you tended to break it. So that whole thing is something we've seen change very slowly, but it takes time to trust the management tools in particular.
Earlier we were looking at kind of a industry trend in using IT systems for longer, and the average age of solutions getting longer, and so with that, particularly when it comes to data, there's going to be a requirement to add extra storage capacity where you don't necessarily need the extra compute and so on. Because if you're an organisation's hanging on to an environment for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, they're going to have to increase the amount of storage capacity there, because data is always going to be growing. And so today there are a number of different processes involved in expanding a given system. And it's a challenge, and that introduces risk, introduces potential failure points, and so being able to leverage some of these fluid resource pools where you can dynamically add more resource and grow that fluid resource pool is also, so there's some fantastic benefits there. But also that's a challenge. That's not the way that we're used to doing things, and so it's more than just infrastructure change. It requires changes in processes and people and skills as well.
It also means we need to do archiving properly, and not just in siloed data sets that we've done in the past where there's been a compliance driver for doing archiving. If we've got to keep all of this data for much longer, for business value reasons, never mind for compliance driven reasons, we need to get into doing archiving seriously on a much broader data set than we've ever done before.
I've got another question, by the way, from James, and the last one was from Nigel, so thank you both very much. The question is this just applicable to large IT departments, or what of SMBs? Are they also, have they got a path to composable for SMBs?
Well, they certainly do. When it comes to composable infrastructure, it's not a product, it's a way of designing and deploying an environment. And these types of principles are relevant if you've just got 5 or 6 servers, or if you've got 5 or 6,000 servers. And so the way that you provision your IT, the way that you deploy your applications and scale up and down, can have fantastic benefits if you only need a smaller environment.
Management simplicity is really the key, and everyone thinks that larger organisations with their much deeper, broader range of skill sets through individuals having coverage in particular areas, that they appreciate simplification less. It's not true. But certainly in smaller organisations where you've got IT generalists rather than specialists in any area, then getting management simplified to make it easier to do things and to automate those processes is really important. And if you can get a solution that fits their needs, based around the sorts of things we've been talking about, the characteristics are absolutely what SMBs need. It's then the question of how much service time needs to go into it, and is that economically viable for smaller businesses?
And the other thing to consider is that many kind of SMB and mid-market type companies and organisations rely more heavily on kind of off-the-shelf software than a larger enterprise that can maybe develop things in-house. And so having a composable infrastructure that can be adapted for kind of more off-the-shelf software and it can be flexible according to the requirements is also a massive benefit for this type of organisation.
We've ended up with quite a nice segue. This wasn't planned. Around you need flexibility, you need scalability. So the question then is, well, how can you actually do this? And if I just move on the slide deck, it's actually about achieving this by engaging with the changes that are happening anyway. So maybe, Tony, here's the changes that are happening anyway.
Yeah.
Is that?
These are the things that the register audience have told us are driving them into changing their IT infrastructure. And you see, we split them into two broad camps. The reactive stuff that's a result of something happening. But top of the list there, guess what's number one? Flexibility. Strange that, isn't it? Complete fluke accident. But that's really important today because it's not like 20 years ago when I was doing IT. When you had relatively stable environments, you could usually do a pretty good job of predicting what was going to happen next and how to deal with it. Those days are pretty much over. You've got to have that flexibility. And coupled with that, because of the whole economic environment that's been around almost since the year 2000, with everyone thought that we spent huge amounts of money in IT for no real reason, instead of making sure that everything did carry on working so no one saw any problems. That sort of carryover since then has put the pressure on proving that everything is being used efficiently and that we can look after what we have here.
I mean, it's interesting that there's flexibility for the business efficiency, flexibility for IT efficiency. They're coupled.
They are intimately coupled. They always have been, but now it's a very explicit coupling. It's very obvious, very visible, whereas in the past it was pretty much invisible because IT wasn't front of mind. Now nearly all business people recognise that without IT, life becomes very, very difficult, if not impossible. And then it moves forward through to things like the proactive drivers, which is this whole transformation, doing the new stuff more effectively. It's not as big for many organisations, but it's still a major factor to bear in mind here. For some, it's much more important than others. But all of this, disruption and do new stuff is very much a pressure in there. So it's getting the balance right for everybody that's important. Interestingly, the external regulatory pressures you see under the reactive stuff is, not the number one issue for most people. It's the last issue. It's important, absolutely, but it's almost a subconscious thing that you've got to do anyway, and doesn't trigger change quite often unless the regulations really do vary dramatically.
I mean, Tim, presumably it's a lot easier for you to engage with someone when they say, "Yeah, we're doing a big transformation. Can you help?" than if they say, "There's some bits we want to tweak."
Well, it does provide an easy entry into these types of discussions and processes.
Yeah.
But I think, looking at some of these kind of key drivers for IT change, there's a number of things here that resonate with this concept of composable infrastructure. That having an environment on which you can build your applications and build your business that is easy to run, that kind of gets out of the way when it needs to and does its job, is I think addresses a lot of these reactive drivers.
It's interesting that if you look on the right-hand side of the chart, there are very, very few of those issues that are not a factor for many people. Everyone is pushed by nearly all of these across the board.
Should we put in the word holistic now, maybe?
I'd rather you didn't.
No, okay, we won't use the word holistic at this point. It was worth a shot. It's always try and get a bit of zen in there. But so over, we're starting to move into the summary now. So maybe if we just shift on, Tim, this is something that you were saying is kind of where you're seeing your different customer groups falling from traditional through to converged, through to hyper-converged, or can you just jump straight into with both feet into a composable world, or do you have to move through as a journey? I don't know, how does it work?
Definitely not. And I think this is displayed on this chart as a nice list of stepping stones. You don't necessarily have to take this journey through each and every single one of them.
Okay, are we converged now?
Well, I think what this is trying to show is that there is a progress over the last few years that we've made as we've gone from one methodology to another. and that Composable kind of leverages a lot of the benefits of things like conversion and hyper-converged, but brings them to a broader and a broader number of applicable environments. So the journey to Composable might include some of these steps, but really is all about rethinking the way that you use IT to run your applications.
Mm-hmm. And you're pushing on an open door is kind of what you say. This is to Tony as well.
Yeah.
People want better management, easier management. They want more automation. They don't want things to break when they try to change anything.
They want more flexibility.
So,
they want to be better able to meet unpredicted needs from their internal customers, and it took me a long time to stop calling them something else. But we just need to be faster at doing everything and being more reliable at doing that.
In terms of investments of effort, I mean, what would you see the curve look like? I mean, does this require a huge upfront effort and then it kind of pans out, or is it kind of you build up to something? How should people consider the amount of time and effort that needs to go into changing how they do it?
Well, there's always going to be some kind of upfront time and effort required, but it can be done in this gradual way of looking at a particular workload that you might have today that you could move into a composable-like environment, and starting with that, getting that up and running, and then slowly starting to move in other workloads onto that single environment. So there is a straightforward way to begin and then to go from there.
And that particular approach to how to move forward does, very much align with the things that the register audience tell us time after time. Every survey we've asked, what's the best way to move forward? It's not rip and replace. It's, start with something new, but put in a solution that gives you that ability to expand beyond it. So you've got a business case for making the change in the first place, but you're putting in a solution that can be expanded to incorporate new and different workloads as and when you're ready.
Should people be thinking about pilot initiatives, or should they be sort of looking at the next major application that they've got and thinking, let's try it, let's adopt these principles with that? Or what
let
do you
me
recommend?
give you an example. We've got a customer we're working with at the moment who's been using their C7000 blade enclosure for 9 years now. It's been around. They've had multiple iterations of blades and so on, but they've had this infrastructure for almost a decade, and we're working on them on deploying composable management and tools on that to essentially give them a composable environment based on some of the infrastructure they've got today. Just so they can start to look at making that workload to leverage some of these fluid resource pools and to get the benefits on some of their infrastructure today. So that's a fantastic starting point for them, is looking at some of the infrastructure they've got today and how that can be adapted ahead of moving more wholeheartedly into composable.
So that, as we can see on this slide, there's a bridge to composable. You don't have to just do it all at once. It's very much something that you can adopt gradually. Which would you rather? I mean, do you think there's a moment at which you just got to kind of bite the bullet, or is it how long should the journey drag on for?
Drag on for.
Does that make sense as a question? I'm just thinking, you don't want to say we're on the journey to composable. We reckon 2 decades, and we'll be kind of more composable than we are. Or do you think there is something people have to kind of seize the reins a little bit?
Well, I think it largely depends on the goals and objectives of the organisation, but just at a base kind of infrastructure tin level, if they've got some raw ingredients today that they're using to run their applications today, then that gives them an easy entry point. But we've got, for us as a vendor, we've got some fantastic new hardware products under our Synergy brand that really give customers an opportunity to roll out new workloads, to deploy new environments in a wholly composable manner. So I think it is possible to have bits of both, whether you need to do a whole new deployment. We've got some fantastic new tools for that, but also if you've got existing ingredients, we can work with those.
And a lot comes down, obviously, to your budget availability. If you're, got a huge investment and you're a startup and you've got your second or third round of funding, then maybe you can dive headlong into, buying something new. Otherwise, nearly everybody else out there has got lots of stuff already, so it's going to be a journey. The question, as you say, is how long that journey takes and how you manage it.
So, starting to wrap up now, I'm kind of wondering if there's kind of composable principles you could start to adopt now, even if you don't change your hardware or software. You could start acting in a more, I guess that's just agile, isn't it? I don't know. Is it just being better at managing stuff?
Well, I think the management is probably the best place to start. To look at what are your management tools and processes today? How many do you have? How complicated is it to be able to do what you need to? because that's really one of the first areas that composable infrastructure can start to bring benefits.
Okay.
So the management is probably the best place to begin.
So we're starting and ending with management. I'll flip on to the last chart we've got here is some further reading for anyone out there. I had a quick chat with Tim earlier, and that first bit.ly link is probably a really good place to start, because if you can't read all of them, it does give you access to a paper which does have a lot of references as well. So that's 29KH, capital M, small e, capital A, if you're listening to the audio only. And just over to both of you guys. I mean, what would be your top two priorities? We've talked about management, so that's a tick already. What would be the things that you would do, Tim, to kick off this journey?
I think once management is sorted, that's no easy task, but the next thing would be to look at the kind of orchestration and provisioning tools that you're looking to use, because that's really what it marries nicely with composable infrastructure to give you that cloud-like speed and agility. So whether that's something like OpenStack or something a bit more simple, whether you're using something like Eucalyptus to talk to public cloud, that would be the next place that I would look and start to focus on.
I would go back to looking at the way IT is budgeted for, and is that really good for the way you're going to be running IT in the future? Because there's a very good chance that it probably isn't. That you need to make your budgeting much more flexible, get the business to fund IT differently, and that's probably a very difficult change to make, even more so than getting the management tools in place. But then beyond that, understanding, well, what are the services that you're delivering, what are the service levels you need, what sort of flexibility do you expect to have in there, so that you can again start making the business case to change the way IT is funded.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tony, and thank you very much, Tim. I think the answer is that the composable IT lies within us all, and it's a case of starting from within and building up from there. So I got some Zen in there right at the end. So do tune in next time if you have any questions or comments or feedback. As always, let us know, and we'll come back to you on any answers that suddenly you think of something. And tune in next time. Cheers.